seminar in our series, our Life Sciences seminar series. Tonight, as you'll see, we are looking at the topic of Alzheimer's, and we're incredibly excited to have two very interesting presentations from two external speakers and one from me a little bit later on. So tonight we're going to start off with an introduction from Paul McMahon, who is here on behalf of the Alzheimer's Society. And I hope that Paul is going to give us a little bit of an insight as to what it's like to be suffering from Alzheimer's, and some of the work, he's going to explain some of the work that they do in helping sufferers of Alzheimer's. Hopefully that will lead quite nicely into the presentation of Professor Paul Francis, who is Professor of Neurochemistry at King's in London. I'm sure Paul won't mind me saying this, but as well as being an eminent scientist and researcher, he's had a few brushes with the law himself, in that he has acted as an expert witness in a number of cases, of patent litigation cases in relation to Alzheimer's treatments in the High Court. So he will perhaps be able to give us a little bit of an insight as to what that's like. He doesn't want to say it in front of the lawyers. He can perhaps tell you at the end over wine. And then I will finish off at the end, just to give you a little bit of an insight as to how the Patents Court has been treating some of the patents that have come before it in relation to treatments for Alzheimer's, and more broadly looking at some of the patents in relation to therapeutic antibodies and some of the issues that have been challenging the courts in terms of determining their validity and infringement. So I will hand over to Paul to
Thank you.
kick us off.
I think I need to turn my mic on as well. The technical bit out of the way. Am I on? Is that? Hello, testing. Should it be higher? Is that okay? Okay, well, thank you all for being here, first of all. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. This is, for me, I'm going to talk about Dementia Friends and run a sort of condensed Dementia Friends session. I will keep my eye on the time because it's supposed to be a 45-minute to an hour session, but I'm going to give you the main sort of material just to give us a glimpse into what it might be like live with Alzheimer's or any form of dementia. One of the things I'm very passionate about Dementia Friends, and one of the things that's great about it is that it puts a positive spin on what it might be like. Obviously it's a very bleak subject and it's always difficult for me to talk about something so sad. But Dementia Friends is all about how it is possible to live well with dementia, and it's a bit of a fun session as well. So I'm sure Paul's going to cover a lot of things with regards to the actual disease itself, but just personally, I'm staggered by the fact that Alzheimer's and dementia, Lewy bodies, I think it was discovered in 1906, and Alzheimer's well over 100 years ago, and here we are today with an epidemic on our hands. And we need to catch up with a lot of other research, like cancer research. If you compare it to things like that, we've come so far with where we are. If you're diagnosed with cancer, that your chances of survival are so much better than they were 25 years ago. As well as the research side of things, the whole stigma about, if you can think like cancer, the big C, 20 years ago, and HIV in the 80s, I feel like we're still there with dementia. There's still that real stigma, and that's part of the problem with people. We want to get people diagnosed so we can help them as much as possible. That's very much what we do and what we're about at Alzheimer's Society. Just briefly before I go into the Dementia Friends, there's an estimated 850,000 people now living with dementia in the UK, set to reach 2 million by 2051. The cost of Alzheimer's is 26 billion per year. So just to put that into context, that's enough to pay all of the household bills in the country for a year. Not that it's all about money, but just puts it where we are as a country. And there's things like it kills 3 times as many people as it does, like women with breast cancer. I could go on with all these kind of comparatives and stats and things, but obviously I'm on a time limit. But just a bit about Alzheimer's Society. In the books that you've got there, it's got all about what we do, so I won't talk about that, but just in brief, we provide support through over 2,000 local services all up and down the country, and our helpline. we invest in groundbreaking research, and we campaign for the rights of people, for people with dementia. And Dementia Friends, just to lead on to the session now, is excuse me if I revert to my notes, because I've got this session I want to deliver. I don't want to miss anything at the same time as keeping my eye on the time. Dementia Friends is a social action movement, and it's funded by the Department of Health for England and the Cabinet Office, and it's led by Alzheimer Society as a strand of its work to create dementia-friendly communities. And our target is to reach 1 million Dementia Friends by the end of this financial year. And we've just gone over the 800,000 mark, so we're well on target to do that. There'll be another big target after that, I'm sure. But it's all going really well. So just to kick the session off, it is kind of an interactive session, but there is going to be a lot of me talking at you as well. If I say the word dementia or Alzheimer's to you, what are the first words that just spring into your head? Anyone?
Old.
Old, yeah?
Memory loss.
Yeah. Confused, yeah. And we could go on with those. It's always an overwhelmingly negative response. It's absolutely correct. But again, it's about what Dementia Friends is about, trying to put a bit more positive, what we can do for people that live with dementia and help them to live better. So, what we'd normally do is play bingo to get these messages across, but I'm going to go through the main messages of Dementia Friends. If I go to, about 25 past, is that okay? Right, the first one is dementia is not a natural part of ageing. Apparently it still happens, but up until very recently anyway, people would go to the doctors and say, I'm worried about my memory, and they'd be told, go home, you're getting old, it's a natural part of ageing. It's absolutely not. It's a disease like any other. If there was kidney or liver disease, obviously it would be treated completely differently. So it's about getting it into what it is and what we can do. And there are things like people as young as 30, and I think there is even a very rare form of people, a child form of dementia, but predominantly we're dealing with elderly. The second one is dementia is caused by diseases of the brain. So as I said, it can be, if there's any other organ, it would be completely different. Another thing I like about Dementia Friends is it uses a lot of analogies. So one of the analogies here is if you can imagine the brain being thousands of fairy lights constantly going on and off. We're always thinking about things, and it's communicated. Our brain uses it by these fairy lights. And if you can imagine some of the bulbs and some of those lights start to go out, our thinking and depending on which part of the brain it's affecting, that will obviously seriously affect us. The next one is the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Does anyone know any other forms of dementia? I think Alzheimer's is about 2/3, but anyone know any others?
Vascular?
Yeah, vascular, Lewy bodies. Very similar symptoms you would see on the surface, but there are, for example, with vascular, I think the decline could be more rapid, then it can plateau. Alzheimer's is more of a gradual decline. So yeah, the most common form is is Alzheimer's. The next one, dementia is not just about losing your memory. We have the 5 main parts of the brain it will affect. So communication, forgetting words, maybe sitting at a dinner table, you can't think of the word knife and fork or pass me the salt or pepper, just can't find the words. That's affecting the communication. Motor skills, so using the knife and fork. Sequencing, difficulties in performing a task, like just putting on a jumper and then putting on 2 skirts instead. Those sort of everyday things that would get wrong. Sequencing, so difficulties in performing, just done sequencing. Changes in inhibition, so someone who may be a really quiet, shy person then goes on to be, then turn out to be really outgoing, or vice versa. And vision, so judging distances. I could say to you, sort of look at this, and you can't tell if that's a mile away, or so it's just hard to show people photos or watch the telly. Again, depending on which part of the brain. The next one is dementia is progressive, which means obviously the symptoms gradually get worse. And so again, what I said about the differences with vascular dementia. The stat here, 1 in 14 now over 65 now live with dementia. Again, it's hard to be exact because of people being diagnosed or sort of not or sweeping it under the carpet. There's another stat here with 1 in 3 over 65 will die with dementia. But that's a bit misleading because you could live to be 100 and then not develop early signs until your 100th birthday. So but there's lots of scary stats that can be misconstrued. Sometimes those aren't necessarily as accurate as they sound. Dementia affects different people in different ways, as I said, depending on what part of the brain, but also on their personality. It's completely as unique as we are unique as people. And it all depends on environment, past life, diet, that kind of thing. Alzheimer's disease usually starts by affecting people's short-term memory. So any ideas why people or anyone might be concerned or worried about going to see a doctor for a diagnosis if they are concerned about their short-term memory? Why might you be afraid to do that?
They might tell you you've got Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly, yeah. And they're effectively giving you a death sentence. Lots of people, I was going to say embrace, but lots of people, because they're so worried for such a long period of time, it's almost a relief to get a diagnosis because then they know what they're dealing with, they can plan for the future and live well, live better with dementia. But also, again, it depends on what type of dementia. Some people can be oblivious to the fact that they've got it. But the more, we're always pushing for people to get diagnosed as soon as possible so that we can help them. And also another thing is the fear and the stigma about that we're trying to get rid of. Dementia can also affect people's perception. So things like, gives a few examples here. Shiny floors may look wet. Patterns of fruit on a tablecloth may look like real fruit. A swirly carpet may look like snakes. Like this carpet even may look a bit like something else. So if you can picture the scenario, you're on a high street, walking into a supermarket, and you're faced with a big black mat. What might you do? What might that mat look like?
Big hole in the ground.
Exactly, a big hole in the ground, and then you're in a supermarket, so it's a big shiny floor. So there's a big hole in the ground and a big, surrounded by a wet floor. So what are you going to do? First thing you do is stop. And I'm one of them people, I'll run into a supermarket just to grab a loaf of bread, and if someone stops in front of me, it's like, you know, and it can be really frustrating. And one of the aims here as well is to just try and understand what that person might be going through. If everyone in that situation was a dementia friend, then not necessarily going to help that person, but you may help the situation, or not make it worse anyway. So yeah, just make the struggle less embarrassing and frustrated for the person and their carer. The next one is, it is possible to live well with dementia. So again, one of the key messages, people with dementia, you know, we want to keep their independence as much as possible. I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. But just things like, if somebody can't make a cup of tea, or rather they can make a cup of tea, but there's one thing they need assistance with, what will often happen is they'll just be put in a chair, don't make tea anymore, I'll do that, you can't do it anymore. But no, we want to keep people as active as much as possible and keep their independence. And the question that throws out here is, what does someone need in order to live well with dementia? And it's just support and understanding them and supporting them. The next one is, there is more to the person than the dementia. It's often, you know, you see somebody old and frail and a bit lost, you see the condition or the disease before you see the person. But that person is actually a wonderful person in life. They're now not well. So it's trying to see beyond the actual dementia itself. That person, it says here, they could have red hair, a broken leg, a great singing voice, a past as an astronaut. They're not just the dementia. And a very short story here, just to kind of get that point across. In the northeast of England, this is a true story, northeast of England, there was an elderly resident in a care home, and she was constantly tapping like this wherever she sat, just constantly. So you can imagine how the carers and the other residents in the home thought it was just this annoying lady that constantly taps away. She didn't really have much love through in the home. Her niece came to visit from Australia apparently, and one of the first things I asked her was, why does she keep tapping? Any idea? Is it just something to do with the disease or what? She didn't know, but they did a lot of research, and one of the things they discovered was that during the war she'd worked at Bletchley Park and helped crack the Enigma code. So it wasn't tap tap tap, it was ... and apparently the Boy Scouts came in and they were able to communicate with her. And people often find this, they can't find the right words, so they'll find other ways of communicating. Could be by some amazingly creative verse or just other ways of trying to communicate, and that's obviously a good example of that. And you can imagine the impact that had on the lady. She had loads of respect and love for everyone in the care home, from totally the opposite. So the final message of Dementia Friends is, Dementia Friends is about turning understanding into action. So what I would like to do is ask all of you in another few minutes if you could commit to some very small action. For example, I mean, you could do a skydive or help fundraise or whatever, but the action could be something just like, we don't like the term dementia sufferer because the whole point is you don't need to suffer with dementia. And a lot of journalists have committed to that, just use living with dementia instead. And it could be like just putting something on social media saying, I've attended Dementia Friends session, it was great, just spreading the word. Any action, small or big, makes you a dementia friend. I've already put the badges and everything on the seats, so you have got a choice, but you haven't really. You're going to be dementia friends in a minute. So yeah, those 5 key messages, I'll come back to them at the very end. What I'd like to do now, just about enough time to do this bookcase analogy. If you can imagine, it says here an 80-year-old woman, but we'll go with man. And I've got a bookcase, sorry that light keeps shining in my eye, a bookcase here next to me. And this represents all of my memories. It's full of books. Now this bookcase is made out of it's a cheap bookcase made out of plywood. Every one of the books represents one of my memories. So the top ones represent my short-term memories, and lower down, obviously, my childhood, infant and my ankles. So if I rock that bookcase, the dementia is rocking the bookcase. Which books are going to fall out first? The top ones, representing my short-term memories. Eventually, obviously, the lower ones are going to fall out too, but a lot slower. So that's why, obviously, the short-term memory is affected. Now, that part of the brain is the hippocampus. Not to get too technical, but that represents, it manages factual and biographical data, faces, names, dates, all that kind of thing. So all those facts I'm forgetting all the time. This side of me, I've got another bookcase, but this one's made out of solid oak. It's still being rocked by the dementia, but this represents the amygdala, which is the emotions and feelings associated with memory. So still being rocked, but those books are going to remain intact, and those memories are going to remain intact for a lot longer than the data. So scenario, if you came to see me, we had a cup of tea, I couldn't remember your name, you got a bit annoyed and frustrated with me, I was driving, I just went home, and I'm driving home, or you're driving home thinking, I'm not going to bother going to see him anymore because he doesn't remember me, and why should I bother? But the point is, I may have forgotten your visit or who you were, but the memories, so that bookcase, all that information is still gone. But the actual emotions and feelings, so the hurt and humiliation that you've left me with, is still there. The other scenario being that you've come to see me, you had a nice chat, whatever, cup of tea, and you've left. Again, I've forgotten who you were or that you were even there, but I'm left with those feelings of, those emotions of love and warmth and comfort that you gave me, and they will stay with me in the same way as it would do anyway. If someone comes to see you and you have a lovely time, you're still going to be feeling those emotions after they've left because you've had a great day, a great time. So this is a good one because people do tend to think they don't remember me. So we see a lot of elderly residents in care homes that don't, it's not they haven't got any family, but they just don't visit them anymore for this reason. But this is just to say that isn't, that shouldn't be the case. Right, I'm going to tie it up with, just want to give one more example of, say I've lost my memories up until, say I'm living in the 50s or the 60s still, and I walk into, because I've lost all the other memories, and all I can remember is my 50s, 60s, or that sort of time, what might be different in a modern day kitchen? Lots of things, yeah, pretty much everything. What might I do if I'm making the cup of tea? Put the kettle on the hob. So again, going back to what I was just saying, you could just say, I'll make the tea from now on, but what else could you do? Exactly. Get down Argos, John, well, I'm not promoting any stores, but get down somewhere and buy an old kettle, and then I could go on making tea for another couple of years or more, because the lower parts of the bookcase are a lot slower. There's lots of analogies and everything with Dementia Friends. If you want to know more about it, we can do more, but obviously we haven't got time on our hands at the moment. I just wanted to finish with just briefly explaining the cards that you've all got. Well, hopefully you've all got one under your bums or somewhere around. But we would encourage you to wear, you are all Dementia Friends now. I would encourage you to wear your badge whenever you can, that would be great. If anyone asks you about Dementia Friends, on the outside flap there is the 5 main messages that I went through. I went through 12, but they're the 5 main points of Dementia Friends. Inside here, if anyone asks you something that you can't answer, or if you want to find out something, if any of you know anyone that's living with dementia, that's our helpline, that 0300 number, or there's like an online talking point forum where that gets you through to our highly trained specialists at head office. I'm not a highly trained specialist. I don't know the things that they know, but they'll be able to advise you. We've got a knowledge centre, which is essentially a library full of literature on dementia and advising people what to do if they're concerned about anything. And we would encourage you as well to fill out the mailers that you've got there. And also, if you could go onto the website and put your details on, you don't have to, but that would obviously be really appreciated as well. And just finally, thank you again. At Alzheimer Society, our vision is a world without dementia. So anything you do to help us, if you can get involved in any fundraising, any support, you're helping us towards that vision, that goal, a world without dementia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I think we'll have questions at the end so that we can keep going. I should have said at the beginning that Alzheimer's Society is one of our nominated charities this year at Bristows. So there's constantly events. A lot of people in this room have been involved in organising, attending events, one of which was last week where we had a tombola for unwanted Christmas presents, in which I successfully managed to win back the miniature limoncellos that somebody gave me for Christmas. So I think I deserve this now. So I'll hand over to Paul.
Okay. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you very much for asking me to come here, and fantastic introduction from somebody working at, if you like, the rock face in communicating what dementia is to people. I'm going to be talking much more about the science behind dementia, and just to say that my group is funded by Alzheimer's Society, Alzheimer Research UK, and particularly the work here, Brains for Dementia Research, which I may just briefly touch on, is also, we work with the Medical Research Council. So Augustita was a patient of Alzheimer at the turn of the last century. She was 56 when she died. She had a disease which we now call Alzheimer's disease. Interestingly, she had a full range of symptoms. She had memory loss, but also she had what we call behavioural change. So at one sense, she was a really interesting index case. So Alzheimer had the ability to, when this Augustita died, took the brain and began to find the links between what he could see in life and what was in the brain. What we now think of as Alzheimer's disease has slightly changed, but it's essentially, we've heard about memory changes, the ability to function at a higher level. It's a gradual cognitive change, and it begins to interfere with your activities of everyday living. So, for example, people may start off just forgetting things, but eventually they cannot go out of the house on their own or whatever, and eventually doubly incontinent and you die. It's not a good message, but there may be things that we can do. The only way we can actually know if somebody has Alzheimer's disease or something else is when we've taken the brain out at the moment. There is no other option. A clinical picture can emerge and you'd be about 80% certain that it was one or other type of dementia, but it's not completely certain. Memory is a big problem, but of course, actually the things that are most troublesome to carers are not just what did you have for lunch or whatever. It's actually if your loved one hits you when you're trying to give them personal care, or they say you're not their husband or spouse or whatever. These are really challenging behaviours. And these are the things perhaps which might be most amenable to treatment. And of course we need to know what people think are the important targets for treating dementia. And in a survey conducted by the European Alzheimer group, the biggest problem, of course, as you might expect, was being able to give your loved one or a bath or something, or leaving them alone for any length of time. And these are really challenging behaviours, being up in the middle of the night. After that came these other behaviours which are more, for example, aggression and agitation, but also changes in personality, depression, just lack of engagement, and only then came cognition. So in terms of what would be your hit list of targets to treat, perhaps some of the things that we think about in terms of what our current treatment's aimed at need to be a little bit revised. So what are we aiming at? What's driving this process? So within the brain, certain parts of the brain are affected by key pathologies. So changes that affect the neurons and their ability to communicate one with another. And the things that we recognize are within cells. We have tangles, which consists of a protein which gets wound round each other, and we have, outside the cell, we have an amyloid deposit, and that amyloid is called A-beta in the case of Alzheimer's disease. And this drives neuron and synapse loss. Part of the function of the brain is to communicate one cell to another, and if you don't have neurons, and particularly if you don't have synapses, that fails. And that drives the symptoms of the disease. It's perhaps shown more clearly here. We can lose cells in Alzheimer's disease, they die, but even those cells that survive, one of these cells in the cortex may communicate with 10,000 other cells. It's losing these connections, and those connections are memory, the ability to control things that we do, the ability to connect things like emotions, visual stimuli, and so on. And it's quite easy to see how this is associated with the dementia, and this is normal function. So how do we get Alzheimer's disease? Well, very rarely, less than 2% of cases, we know that it's a single gene defect. And the gene defects are either in a gene called amyloid precursor protein, or chromosome 21, small number of case, or another gene called presenilin, which comes in two different forms. And the red bit is the A-beta that we see in plaques. So that links this very neatly, the genetics, to that. Presenilin has a different function, but it's actually linked to this protein. So everything about the genetics, 2% of cases, gives us a link to A-beta and so on. The problem is, these people are so rare, do they actually tell us about the main bulk of the disease, the 98% which isn't caused by that? Probably they do, but we need to be aware that these people get dementia much earlier. So they may have some subtle differences. Beyond that, we have risk genes. So genetics does play a huge part in determining whether or not people get dementia. Aside from that small population, in this room we will have a widespread genotypes according to ApoE. So most of us will be 3-3. Some of us will have one or more copies of E4. If you look at a group of people who don't have Alzheimer's disease, this is the pattern, sort of roughly 2.5 to 1 of E3 to E4, and that changes dramatically, so that you have between an 8 and a 16 times greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease if you carry E4. Not deterministic, but a risk gene. And beyond that, there are many other genes which have tiny effects. And maybe 60 or 70% of Alzheimer's disease can be explained by genetic risk. So given the genetics, it was quickly established that the most likely cause of everything we see could be traced back to A beta and how it was handled. So the amyloid cascade hypothesis, which has been the predominant hypothesis for many years, suggests that it's something about increasing the levels of A beta, which drives deposition of A beta into plaques. By some yet fully understood mechanism, this causes tangles within cells, and we get all of these transmitter changes and synapse loss and neuron loss. It's a hypothesis. It has been taken probably too strongly in terms of what we've done to try and develop treatments for Alzheimer's disease. And a little cartoon. So the other thing, or if we start reversing, so this is somebody attempting to draw a clock, which is one of the key things that you can do to determine whether somebody has dementia and what type of dementia. The thing which is driving that most closely are the neurons and the synapses. They're actually causing directly this change. If you take a step back, probably the next thing which is important in driving this in terms of time is the formation of these tangles within cells. We have microglial activation. The immune system gets involved, perhaps trying to help, which may not be its best option. But going back perhaps now 20 to 30 years before we see the symptoms, we have this amyloid deposition. So something's going wrong with A beta a long time before we get the clinical symptoms. And that's emphasized here. So this is where you may get a diagnosis. You may, if you're really lucky, in a specialist center 10 years before or 5 years before, actually have something which you say, this could be going to develop dementia. We call this mild cognitive impairment. This is reasonably well known. Most of the treatments are being given here at the moment. If we could start them here, we might have a better chance. But actually, you know, it's a long time earlier that probably one of the main changes is occurring. So what can we do? If we think about this rationally, we can sort of think, well, we could just try and treat the symptoms, try and improve the memory. There are lots of things that people suggest which may improve memory, whether it's doing Sudoku, being involved in activities and all those sort of things. But there are pharmacological approaches that you can do that. Importantly, also, there may be opportunities to improve behaviour, to make people more manageable for their carers, to keep that relationship better at home and even within a care home setting. So these are important things to do, but they are not tackling the disease. Disease modifying and slowing has been the sort of traditionally the next step, and that really means getting involved with the pathology and the mechanisms driving the pathology. And perhaps we've lost our way a little bit in how we've tried to identify what might be key things. Of course, you know, prevention would be a great thing, but we're nowhere near that. In terms of symptoms, it's a wide range of symptoms. Often drugs are targeting memory, but you know, what about all these other things? Behavior and mood, and also to what extent, if you fix this, might you fix this to improve the activities of daily living. So going back to the beginning of what we think of as pharmacotherapy for Alzheimer's disease, in the mid-1970s, a group at the Institute of Neurology and one in Newcastle and elsewhere in the UK discovered that there was a change in the cholinergic system. Acetylcholine is a small but important neurotransmitter in the brain. And we can measure various aspects of the function of neurotransmitter acetylcholine. We can measure how it's made, we can measure how it interacts with receptors and so on. So this is one level of communication. And from this study, actually done on post-mortem human brain and also rarely from biopsy material, some of these studies I was involved in, we actually built up a picture which said that the cholinergic system was involved, there were big reductions in some things, but actually the receptors, the targets for this acetylcholine were relatively well preserved. Now what that meant is there was an opportunity to make drugs which could correct or make up for this abnormality. And clinically, we were able to show that there was a relationship between how severe the dementia was and this reduction in acetylcholine. So that made it, a useful target and clinically relevant. And of course, this drove the pharma industry to develop drugs, and, for example, donepezil, which was the first onto the market, showed astonishing results, fantastic results. No, I'm joking. What it showed was, on a 30-point scale, that we could actually move people up a little bit. So on average, they might score 1 to 2 points better than if they weren't receiving the treatment. The numbers involved in this study, 3, 4, 500 people. For an individual person with dementia, that effect wasn't statistically significant. The doctor would be hard-pressed to find it. But overall, it is important. And I don't want to belittle this. This is rational drug design. Finding what the problem is, trying to fix it, find a solution, testing it, and actually then getting benefits. Memantine was a later drug that came on the market, a different mechanism of action, but again, this is the extent of what we can do. Symptomatic treatment. The bad news is that in terms of behavioral involvement in dementia, in this case depression, this was a study conducted by some of my colleagues at King's, showing that antidepressant medication, which works in people without dementia to improve their depression, has absolutely no effect whatsoever on depression in dementia. Very bad news, because depression is a significant problem. And this is a study by my colleague Clive Ballard showing that if you give people neuroleptics, which you're using to control agitation and aggression, you can kill them. It's a very successful way of killing people with dementia, is to give them extended treatment with antipsychotic medication. So the news is that we do have some good things for treating people with dementia, but our momentum is very small and very limited. So arguably, we really, really, really do need new and better symptomatic treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Post-mortem research, which is something I'm passionate about, has provided a lot of the clues to understanding what's wrong with people with dementia and how we might try and develop new drugs. It's also in the importance in terms of establishing a diagnosis and things like that. If we just take ourselves back into the 1960s, end of the 1950s, 1960s, Arvid Carlsson won Nobel Prize for discovering a method for measuring dopamine and establishing that this was an important neurotransmitter in terms of motor function. Olli Hornakevitz then showed that it was reduced in Parkinson's disease. And that was 1 year from discovery to the clinical trial, a little bit longer until it actually became into practice. In terms of Alzheimer's disease, these three groups were working on the cholinergic system, and it took, depending on how you look at it, between 10 and 22 years to go from the initial discovery of what was wrong to actually having a drug on the market which was actually addressing these symptoms. Whose fault's that? Not really sure. It may just be more complex. Clinical trial. BDR, I'm not really going to talk about this, but this is what I do and this is my passion. We are asking people to sign up during life, have assessments, and then donate their brain. People with and without dementia. And I'm not going to go through this, it's too long to do that. Into the modern era, if you like, a wonderful new world of disease-modifying drugs. In 1999, if you were a mouse, we could cure your Alzheimer's disease. On the left-hand side, my lord, may I show the evidence that we have a mouse with Alzheimer's disease? And on the right, we have one without. Except, this is not a model of Alzheimer's disease, it is a model of amyloid deposition. We can introduce a vaccination against A-beta, and effectively that clears A-beta from the brain. By dint of a clinical study which used active immunization, Athena, Elan, gave this antibody adjuvant and A-beta to people, and unfortunately some of them developed some inflammation, so the trial couldn't continue. But because they were making antibodies, you couldn't get rid of them, and eventually these people died. So we could actually do the experiment that we'd done in the mouse. And interestingly, we find, compared to somebody who was unimmunized, that actually in most cases we had a very similar picture. The amyloid had disappeared. Interestingly, cognition, absolutely no change. So you could do in the humans what you could do in the mouse, but it had no impact on cognition. Interesting study, and again, this is just similar sort of information provided in a slightly different way. We have all sorts of other ways of dealing with A-beta. We can inhibit its production, we can target oligomers of A-beta which go on to form plaques, we can interfere with the immune system, very many other ways of doing it. But what you'll notice about this is it's all about amyloid. And that's probably a major problem with drug discovery in terms of disease-modifying drugs. We've put all our eggs in one basket. And is this going to be a successful treatment? Development's been going on for 15 years, and we've had 2 major trials which have failed. They failed, and look at, these are just 2 from one of the solanezumab Lilly drug. They failed on their primary outcome measures. So that means they failed. Why? Probably because, going back to one of the points that I made at the beginning, amyloid, it's all happened. It's all past. What's driving the clinical symptoms, and note that the outcome measures are actually clinical symptoms, cognition. These are not being driven directly by amyloid. If you could actually get back at the right time and give these drugs, which is what they're trying to do now, you might actually prevent it in the future, but they're really, really long clinical trials. So here is the, if you like, the Hall of Shame. We have 2 drugs which made it through based on neurotransmitter approaches, cholinesterase inhibitors and memantine. We had a whole range of drugs which were actually targeted at A-beta, and solanezumab is the only one which is going forward, and that's going forward in the genetically identified group. Fortunately, we have a few more compounds coming through which are actually addressing symptoms, which is good news, and we hope that phase 3 trials will be good. One drug targeted at tau, which is the other cardinal hallmark of the disease. We are 20 years behind where we should be in terms of developing drugs in that area. We have a couple of other things very interesting, a dietary compound, mixture of various things, which maintains synaptic integrity. I'm reading it off there just to make sure I don't get it wrong. And that passed phase 3, but that was in a food supplement, not as a novel chemical. So why am I here? You tell me. Okay. It's mostly because not only, as Liz said, am I a scientist, but I've, as she said, gone to the dark side. I help you guys a little bit. So what have I done? I've worked, if you like, for the good guys in some of your cases, or the bad guys, depending on how you look at it, the big companies, in helping them understand how their drugs work. And as a consequence of that, it's quite normal to then perhaps provide some expert evidence. So I was involved in Novartis in a generics challenge, and I've also been involved in the two heavyweights, if you like, between two pharma companies around the immunotherapy. I've done various other bits outside the UK in terms of Canada, where it's a rather different system, as I'm sure you've been aware. And outside that, I've actually done some advice which never came to court. But I have been tortured by the barristers, put on the spot, and it's an interesting experience. I think it's one which I wouldn't say enjoy, but I can see that it makes me think differently. It challenges the way I think as a scientist to actually accommodate something else, and I learn stuff. I really do. I mean, I'm incredibly impressed, firstly by the solicitors who seem to pick stuff up faster than, I'm sort of thinking, how does that work? And they're there already. So, I admire you guys for doing that. And the barristers, well, they're a bit show-off, but they do tend to do a good job as well. But seriously, I've enjoyed doing it. I think it's useful for me. I'd be interested to know how useful it really is in the wider picture, but given the way that the law works and patent works, I think it must be of value to somebody. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. That's fascinating. I think if you feel you're on the dark side, I've definitely moved to the dark side. I've certainly been a lawyer for far longer than I've been a neuroscientist, so I'm certainly not in your league anymore. So for the last sort of 15 to 20 minutes tonight, we're going to look a little bit more at the patent side, and Paul has given quite a nice segue into that. It's clear from the therapies and treatments that Paul was talking about that there are various different therapies being explored and innovated, but one of the key ones I think that's coming through the courts, and something that's reflective of the way that we're seeing biologic patents coming through the courts, is that they're all relating these days to therapeutic antibodies. And I think for those of you who have been in this field for a while will realise that for the last 20 or 30 years, the field of biotech, and particularly biologics as medicines, has become an exciting and stimulating topic, particularly when it's compared to the so-called pharmaceutical patent cliff, where a lot of the small molecules are coming off patent and there isn't a replacement. And within the field of biotech, therapeutic antibodies is clearly one of the most lucrative areas for drug development and commercialisation. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with examples like Abbott's acquisition of Humira in 2001, where Abbott acquired Humira for, I think it was $7 million from a company called Knoll Pharmaceuticals. And the last figures I saw is that it is one of the world's largest drugs, selling at approximately $10 billion worth of sales a year. And I certainly think it's, if not in the top 3, it's in the top 2. So clearly in an area like this, patent protection is pretty important. And yet protection has developed over the year as innovation has developed and more about the area is known. So as the field of therapeutic antibodies has grown, the sort of once virgin territory for researchers has become quite a crowded field of exploration. Previously, patent opportunities were only really limited by access that researchers had to the human genome and access to the nature and scope of the bioinformatics tools to hand. But I think probably more importantly, and certainly of no insignificance to the patent attorneys amongst you, those first early patents, there wasn't really that much prior art around. And so the concept that antibodies could lead to a therapeutic treatment was simply that, a concept awaiting for verification. Obviously, more recently, as the field has developed and matured, and markets going strength to strength, these patents that were originally filed are now coming through and starting to appear in our courts and are now having to contend with judicial scrutiny. So just a quick reminder, for those of you who are not so familiar with challenging patents, there are a number of grounds on which a patent can be challenged and alleged to be invalid. And I've put the ones that are probably of more interest to us here tonight up on the screen. Unsurprisingly, given the priority dates of a number of these patents, generally novelty and priority it's not really been the sort of focus for many of these cases. Rather, most of the judgments that we're going to look at tonight have been looking at the extent to which the teaching of the patent must be plausible to be patentable. And that can come into two areas. Generally, it's come into the test for obviousness and also into the test for insufficiency. Now, the more astute of you who have been reading the slides will realise that plausibility isn't a ground for revocation. And yet, in the cases that we have seen recently, it has been manifesting itself as a consideration of whether the invention disclosed is sufficiently plausible to support the claimed invention. And actually, although the cases we're going to look at tonight are from the last 2 or 3 years, this issue of plausibility first reared its head in 2008 in a stent case in Cohen and Angiotech, where Lord Hoffman was looking at the concept of aggrevo obviousness. Now, I've put up what we mean by aggrevo obviousness here on the slide, but just to give you a little introduction for those of you who are not familiar with EPO case law, aggrevo was a case that came before the Technical Board of Appeal, and it was a claim in a completely different sector. It was a claim to a class of chemical compounds to be used as herbicides. Now, the Technical Board of Appeal had no difficulty finding that the claim, which was claimed by way of a Marcouche formula, so a very broad number of compounds were included in the claim, was sufficient because all the chemicals that were claimed could be made. There was no difficulty there. However, they found that there was nothing inventive in making in the compounds and nothing to justify the assertion that all the compounds claimed had were herbicidal. And therefore they said that there must be a technical effect that is reasonably predictable or fairly assumed or credible. And if you don't have that technical effect, then the problem has not been solved and there can't be an invention. Now, this is a particularly relevant to the EPO assessment of obviousness, which tends to look at a problem-solution approach, which is not the way that we do it here in the UK. So you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that perhaps it had no relevance to UK patent law. However, as we'll see by the 3 cases we're about to look at, that this has become a consideration from the UK courts, and it's particularly of significance for patents for treatments like Alzheimer's, because effectively what it boils down to is whether you have put enough in your specification to justify the breadth of claim that you've made and the extent to which you should be putting clinical data in your patent. And as we've heard from Paul already, that can be quite difficult in diseases like Alzheimer's, when really you can only be confident that your treatment is efficacious once you've done a post-mortem. So I've got 3 cases to look at tonight. We're just briefly going to go through them. We don't have time really to go into the details of the case, but the first is Regeneron and Genentech. So Regeneron and its licensee Bayer sought revocation of Genentech's patents. And of particular interest for us, there were sufficiency attacks on the patent, amongst other things. First of all, Regeneron said it was not possible to make a reasonable prediction from the data in the patent that the anti-VEGF therapy, which was claimed, would be effective in the whole range of diseases. So the VEGF antagonists included antibodies to VEGF and also to the VEGF receptor. So they said that there was undue claim breadth because they've basically overstretched themselves and claimed more than they'd enabled. There was also some post-dated evidence showing that certain VEGF antagonists were not therapeutically active. So what did the court do? Well, quite interestingly, and we'll see this as a theme as we look through these cases, The arguments on plausibility were advanced by the parties as part of their obviousness case, and you can understand why, because effectively this was introduced into UK case law in Cohen and Genentech as an obviousness ground and a challenge to inventive step. But quite interestingly, what the court decided to do was to treat it as a sufficiency attack. And I think this is because the court recognised that actually the test for obviousness in the EPO and in the UK is quite different. And they saw it much more as an enablement issue and therefore to be considered as insufficiency. And what they said, and this case went obviously up to the Court of Appeal, was that it must be possible to make a reasonable prediction that the invention will work with substantially everything falling within the scope of the claim. So it's clear that it was not necessary to show that everything within your claim works and show efficacy in all range of conditions, but that if you are claiming a broad application, then as long as it's technically plausible that that application will work, you do not have to show that everything falling within your claim would work. Obviously, the danger with that is that if it later turns out that some of the products that you claim are not in fact therapeutic efficacious, then you risk insufficiency. But that didn't happen in this case. The court felt that there was enough there and not enough to challenge that the general principle and plausibility of the technical contribution was enough. Later that year, there was another case, Eli Lilly and Janssen, and something that Paul alluded to and in fact acted for one of the parties. And it was a similar type of attack on the patent. What was interesting about this is that this was a battle between two originators who were both developing antibody treatments. But one, Janssen, had a patent to all antibodies to a specific peptide antigen in beta amyloid. And as we've heard, that's a protein implicated in Alzheimer's. So Lilly sought to clear the way by revocation and applied for a declaration of non-infringement before it launched its product. Again, there were a number of grounds of invalidity, but like Regeneron, the patent was attacked for failing to enable the invention without undue burden, and for failing to enable the invention to be performed over the whole scope of the claim. And these attacks came on two grounds. The first was that there was an example in the patent that showed that only N-terminal antibodies were effective. So whilst the claim was much broader than that, there was an example showing that a smaller group of subset of those antibodies were effective. Secondly, Lilly relied on a phase 3 clinical trial which was published after the patent, which basically showed that despite the patentee's best efforts over a 10-year period and having invested hundreds of millions of dollars into trying to develop a treatment, they hadn't been able to get any of the antibodies claimed in their patent to work. So, what did the court do? Well, again, just like Regeneron, plausibility was argued under the head of obviousness, but dealt with by the court under the ground of insufficiency. And what the Court of Appeal said following Regeneron was that at the priority date it must be possible to make the prediction that the invention would work substantially with everything falling within the claim. And it's insufficient if it's not possible to make that prediction at the priority date. And even if it is possible to make that prediction at the priority date, if it's later showed that that prediction is wrong, then your patent is insufficient. So the question arising about whether post-published evidence is admissible to test the prediction is yes. So there was now a possible sort of post hoc ability for somebody to apply to revoke a patent on the basis that even though it potentially was deemed plausible at the priority date of the patent, something published after the priority date could show that that prediction was wrong. And what the court said is that it's plausible that the therapy would work with a suitable antibody, but not any antibody. It was only because of this example 2, effectively, that the patent said, you've shown that not all the antibodies you claimed worked. And whilst there was this phase 3 data available to the court, and no doubt it was quite persuasive of the court. What the court tried to do was base its decision on the data in the patent, although inevitably the phase 3 clinical trial data was quite prejudicial. So what the court did in determining whether post-dated evidence could be used was to formulate this two-part test. Determine whether the disclosure makes it plausible that the invention will work across the scope of the claim, and to do that you look at the patent as a whole, and later to look at whether post-dated evidence establishes that in fact the invention cannot be performed across the scope of the claim without undue burden. And that was clearly prejudicial on the judge. So the last case we're going to look at is a more recent case of Herceptin and Genentech. Again, it was to a monoclonal antibody for the treatment of breast cancer, well known as Herceptin, and Herceptin was seeking to clear the way to launch its generic version. And actually this is quite interesting because it's the first biosimilar case that's come up in the patents court. Both patents had already been held invalid by the opposition division but were under appeal. And what was quite interesting about this is that it shows how patentees and parties are getting more sophisticated at arguing and using the court's sort of interpretation of things like plausibility to squeeze parties into a particular position. And this is the first time that we saw a squeeze being run between inventive step and sufficiency. And the issue was, in relation to the dosage patent, was that the court found the patent obvious over the US FDA label for Herceptin, and they basically said that they thought it would be obvious to carry out a clinical trial having seen the FDA label for Herceptin, and therefore the claim was obvious. However, they went further and said, well, if we're wrong on that, and if it's not obvious, and this is where the issue of plausibility comes in, if we're wrong on that and when it's not obvious, then you haven't contained clinical data in your patent to show the outcome of that clinical trial. So even if your claim is inventive, it's insufficient because you've not put enough data in there. That case has been appealed. I understand it was heard in January, and that we're going to have a decision towards the end of this week from the Court of Appeal. What Mr. Justice Burst did in that case as well is he looked at plausibility, which up until now had only really been looked at as a ground of insufficiency. He looked at it for other areas of law where there's a requirement of enablement. So he looked at it for the test for novelty and was asked to consider whether plausibility had a place there for novelty. And he thought that in theory it probably did, because there is an enablement requirement to proving lack of novelty, but actually it wasn't a particularly helpful concept. Where he thought it was more helpful was in relation to priority. And this is where he diverged a little bit from EPO case law, which has basically said that it's not necessary for a priority document to contain data which made it plausible. And I think the judge was quite reluctant to depart from that, but he did think there was a place for plausibility in a priority assessment. Although he said, you know, one has to be very careful about this, but the danger is if you don't look into the issue of plausibility, then effectively speculative applications could be possible, and they would steal a march on the competition, and he actually described it as a recipe for abuse. So no doubt we may well see those kind of arguments being run in the future. So just to finish up, how does this help us with filing strategies for new and emerging treatments? As always with patent filing, and we've got lots of patent attorneys here whose job it is to try and get the balance right, the balance is between filing early and planting your flag for novelty and making sure that you minimise any difficult prior art and you prevent any unhelpful developments in the common general knowledge affecting your validity of your patent. You have to balance that against all of the things that we've been talking about. We haven't actually talked about industrial applicability because we haven't got time tonight, but there was also a case between HGS and Lilly which looked at plausibility really in relation to industrial applicability. And particularly in that case, it was quite interesting because there was no sort of wet lab data in the patent itself. It was all done on bioinformatics. So they claimed a group of therapeutic compounds basically on a prediction that those compounds would act in the same way to others that had been identified through bioinformatics. So that had no data in the patent at all. and yet because it was a principle of general application and there was nothing to contradict it, the patent was upheld. So after HGS, it's clear that there must be a real as opposed to a purely technical possibility of exploitation, but you don't actually have to put the data in the patent. It's clear that part of the difficulty with the test, and something that the courts have been grappling with, is the fact that this whole plausibility of the technical contribution has come from an EPO line of thought relating to obviousness, which doesn't quite fit into our assessment of validity in the UK. And there is this kind of divergence, although very recently there was a case that came before the courts between Idonex and Gilead, where actually the court chose to look at plausibility as part of the obviousness test. So maybe the tide is turning a little bit there, and that's certainly one to watch. So what practical considerations should patentees and those who want to challenge patents be thinking out? Well, obviously the question is, what must my specification provide in order to be sufficient, short of full clinical proof? Often these claims are to efficacious treatments. They need support to prove they're efficacious, and therein lies the squeeze, particularly for developing treatments for hard to diagnose diseases like Alzheimer's. How do you prove that it's efficacious? Quite difficult to do that. You can only do it once you've got the post-mortem and you've got the data, and that can take an awful lot of time, in which case you've then lost your filing early advantage. I think it's probably likely in the future that we're going to see it more difficult to get patents for principles of general application. But if we are going to be applying for those patents, then the case law seems to suggest, when you look at HGS and Regeneron, that the patents that are being upheld are those which actually don't contain very much data at all to show whether the theory of application works or not. But I think one of the key messages is that if we take it all back and stand back a step, plausibility has become a really sort of buzzword and buzz area at the moment, and it's something that not many people really understand where it's going. Taking it back to Cohen and Genentech, which was the House of Lords case where Lord Hoffman first looked at a Brevo office, he was very keen to point out that to the extent that plausibility is relevant, the threshold is low. It's a very low threshold. All you need is a plausible or reasonably credible or educated guess will suffice. And it looks like in the recent cases that have come through the courts, this has been elevated to something more than that. So I think the answer is to watch this space, and let's see what happens next. Thank you very much. So we do have